So, I want you to picture this. It's the weeks immediately following the September 11th attacks back in 2001.
A really, really tense time for everyone.
Exactly, just this global state of shock.
Yeah.
And millions of people are opening their email inboxes to find this exact same forwarded chain email.
Right, the infamous prophecy email.
Yeah, it contained this 4-line poem, a quatrain, that supposedly predicted the fall of the Twin Towers with just like chilling, impossible accuracy.
It was everywhere.
It really was. It read, let me get the exact quote here. Okay. In the city of God, there will be a great thunder, two brothers torn apart by chaos. While the fortress endures, the great leader will succumb. The third big war will begin when the big city is burning.
I mean, you could see why people panicked.
Oh, absolutely. People were totally stunned. I mean, it had the exact imagery. City of God for New York, two brothers for the towers, the fortress for the Pentagon. It even came with a date attached 1654.
Which is incredibly specific.
Right. But there was only one massive, glaring problem with this terrifying glimpse into the future. It was completely 100% fake.
It was a total fabrication.
Yeah.
I mean, Nostradamus died in 1566, so he obviously couldn't have written anything dated 1654 anyway.
Yeah, slight historical oversight there.
Just a bit. But the real twist is that this poem wasn't written by a 16th century mystic at all. It was actually written in 1997 by a Canadian college student named Neil Marshall.
Wait, a college student?
Yeah, he wrote it as part of an academic paper. He was specifically designing it to prove a thesis, basically, that you can write a vague, ominous-sounding poem packed with apocalyptic archetypes, and eventually, if you wait long enough, some tragic historical event will occur that maps onto it perfectly.
Wow. So he literally proved his own thesis in the most dramatic, global way imaginable.
He really did. Someone took his academic example, stripped his name off it, slapped the name Nostradamus on it, and millions of people just bought it without a second thought.
And that, right there, that collective desperation to believe that psychological need to find order in the darkest moments of human history, that is exactly what we are dismantling today.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. So welcome to this deep dive. Our mission today is to really unpack the life, the highly specific occult mechanics, and the intensely enduring controversies of the world's most famous and definitely most misunderstood seer Michel de Nostredame, better known as Nostradamus.
And to do this properly, we're pulling from a massive stack of sources today.
Oh yeah, we've got a lot to get through.
We're looking at comprehensive historical biographies of his life as a Renaissance doctor and apothecary. We also have detailed breakdowns from modern Wiccan practices, analyzing his highly specific 16th century water scrying rituals.
Which are wild, by the way.
Totally. Plus, we're reading directly from Nostradamus' own personal letters, specifically the cryptic preface he wrote to his son, Caesar. And we're applying skeptical linguistic analyses of his translations from investigators like James Randi, while also diving deep into modern academic research by scholars like Jacques Heilbronn.
Heilbronn is the one who tracked down the exact ancient textbooks Nostradamus was secretly pulling from, right?
Exactly. We're going to get into all of his secret source material.
Okay, let's unpack this, because history is often treated like an autopsy, We look back and categorize exactly what happened and why, but prophecy, on the other hand, is treated like a diagnosis of tomorrow.
That's a good way to put it.
But when you look closely at Nostradamus, he isn't giving us an MRI of the future. He is giving us a linguistic Rorschach test.
A 16th century ink blot.
Exactly. And to understand why he built that Rorschach test, you have to understand the terror of the world he was born into. So let's look at the man before the myth.
What's fascinating here is that he was born Michel de Nostredame in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence in December 1503. And right out of the gate, he is born into a family defined by hidden identities.
And the constant existential threat of being discovered, yeah.
That is the foundational context for his entire life. His family was relatively wealthy and educated, but they carried this massive generational burden. His father's family, going back to his grandfather Cresquas and his great-grandfather Estruge of Carcassonne, had originally been Jewish.
Right, but they converted.
Yes, around 1459 or 1460, they officially converted to Catholic Christianity. They took the Christian name Pierre and adopted the surname Nostradame, meaning Our Lady.
Because that was the saint on whose feast day their conversion was solemnized, right?
Exactly.
And we know this wasn't just like a casual religious awakening. In the mid to late 15th century in that region, conversion was a brutal survival mechanism. It was the only way to escape the escalating pressures that would eventually culminate in the Inquisition.
Precisely. They were what was known as conversos, or new Christians.
Yeah.
And in that era, converting didn't just mean you were suddenly accepted by society.
Far from it.
You lived under the perpetual specter of the Inquisition. The authorities were constantly hunting for secret, lingering Jewish practices, what they called Judaizing.
Which could be something as simple as what you ate, right?
Oh, absolutely. If you lit a candle on a Friday night, or avoided pork, or honestly even bathed too frequently, your neighbors might report you.
Just for taking a bath.
Yes, because frequent bathing was associated with Jewish ritual purification. The threat of being investigated for heresy, stripped of your wealth, tortured, or straight up burned at the stake was a daily reality for them.
So Nostradamus was raised in an environment where hiding your true thoughts, obscuring your beliefs, and presenting this flawless, impenetrable exterior to the authorities was literally a matter of life and death.
Which is why that instinct for encryption is baked into his DNA long before he ever wrote a single prophecy.
That explains so much about his later writing style, it really does. So he grows up in this tense but highly educated household. At 15, around 1518, he goes to the University of Avignon to study for his baccalaureate.
Getting that classical education.
Yeah, he is diving into the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic. These are the foundational linguistic tools of the Renaissance. But he only gets about a year of this formal education before the universe throws a massive curveball.
A horrific curveball.
Right. The university physically shuts its doors and kicks everyone out because the bubonic plague rolls into Avignon.
The Black Death was just an omnipresent terror back then. We often think of the plague as a single event in the 1300s, but it came back in waves for centuries, just constantly devastating cities.
He was always lurking.
Yeah. And when the university closed, Nostradamus didn't just retreat to his family estate and hide. He actually spent the next 8 years, starting around 1521, traveling the countryside, deeply embedded in the rural response to the plague.
He became an apothecary, right?
Exactly. He researched herbal remedies, worked directly with the sick, and learned the practical, messy reality of handling raw ingredients to fight disease.
Which brings us to a really fascinating clash of classes, because after 8 years in the mud, working as a rural apothecary, he decides he wants to formalize his medical career.
He wanted the official title.
Right. So in 1529, he enters the prestigious University of Montpellier to get his medical doctorate, and he is almost immediately expelled.
It was a very short stint.
I was looking into the specific statutes of Montpellier at the time, and the reason he was kicked out is completely wild by modern standards. He was expelled by the student procurator, this guy named Guillaume Rondelet, specifically because Nostradamus had been working as an apothecary.
Yes, and the actual document recording his expulsion still exists today in the faculty library at Montpellier.
That's amazing that we still have the receipt, basically.
We really do. To understand this, you have to grasp the incredibly rigid, almost absurd hierarchy of Renaissance medicine. It was deeply rooted in medieval scholasticism. The physicians, the doctors with degrees, viewed themselves as philosophers.
They weren't getting their hands dirty.
Not at all. They read Galen and Hippocrates in Latin. They theorized about the four humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. They believed their job was purely intellectual observation and diagnosis.
Right, so actually touching the patient or mixing a medicine was beneath them.
Completely beneath them. Handling herbs, grinding roots, mixing compounds, that was considered a manual trade. The university statutes expressly banned anyone practicing a manual trade from seeking a doctorate. The physicians looked down on apothecaries the same way an aristocratic architect might look down on a bricklayer.
Wow.
Furthermore, during his time in the countryside, Nostradamus had apparently been quite vocal in slandering these theoretical doctors.
I mean, I don't blame him.
Right. Probably because he saw firsthand that their primary treatment, bleeding patients with leeches to balance the humors, was actually killing people faster.
It's the equivalent of a modern medical board revoking a trauma surgeon's license because they found out the surgeon used to be a frontline paramedic who publicly criticized hospital administrators for being out of touch.
That is a perfect analogy.
But this expulsion doesn't stop him. He completely bypasses the academic gatekeepers and goes right back to fighting the plague on his own terms. And he builds a massive reputation doing it. He invents a treatment that becomes famous. The rose pill.
Yes, the famous rose pill.
I was looking at the pharmacological breakdown of this pill in the sources, and he was shockingly close to actual immunology.
It really was. The rose pill was his signature herbal remedy, And unlike the bloodletting and astrology-based purgatives pushed by the university doctors, it actually demonstrated some practical effectiveness in combating mild infections.
What was actually in it?
The surviving recipes show that he used a mixture of crushed rose petals, rose hips, cloves, iris, aloe, and the sawdust of green cypress.
And the key ingredient there is the rose hips, right? Because we now know they contain massive concentrated doses of vitamin C.
Exactly.
So while his contemporaries are literally draining the blood out of plague victims, Nostradamus is essentially flooding their systems with immune-boosting antioxidants.
He was definitely ahead of his time. He also championed basic hygiene, insisting on fresh air, clean water, and removing infected corpses from the streets immediately. He was intuitively grasping germ theory centuries before Louis Pasteur.
He was a highly effective, pragmatic healer, and because of this success, his life finally stabilizes. He is invited to Agen around 1531 by Jules César Scaliger, who is this leading Renaissance scholar, and he becomes his mentor. Nostradamus marries a woman some historical sources suggest her name was Henriette d'Encausse, though the records are a bit fragmented and they have 2 children.
He had built a really solid life for himself.
By all accounts, he has achieved the Renaissance dream. He has a respected career, a family, a prominent mentor, and wealth. And then, unfortunately, we hit the year 1534.
Yes, this is where everything falls apart.
The plague returns to Agen. Nostradamus, the man whose entire identity is built on fighting this disease, the inventor of the rose pill, the guy who survived the front lines for a decade, is totally powerless.
It's heartbreaking.
While he is out treating other people, his wife and both of his young children contract the plague and die. It's hard to even fathom the psychological devastation of that.
It really is.
You spend your life studying a monster, you build weapons to fight it, you save strangers from it, and then the monster slips into your house and takes your entire world.
The historical consensus is that this trauma fundamentally fractured his worldview. This is the pivotal psychological pivot of his entire life.
It had to be.
For over a decade, he had put his complete faith in practical medicine, in observation, in the physical reality of the body. He had fought the establishment to prove his methods worked, and in the end, none of it mattered. It failed him completely.
Right.
When human intervention, science, and medical protocol fail so spectacularly to provide safety, the human mind desperately seeks control elsewhere. If the physical world is this chaotic and cruel, you look to the heavens. You look for a grand, divine, overarching system where everything happens for a reason.
It makes me think of a modern scenario. Imagine a highly trained, rational trauma surgeon today. They believe in the scientific method, the physical mechanics of tissue and bone. Then they suffer a loss so sudden and senseless that the scientific method offers absolutely zero comfort.
Exactly.
It wouldn't be entirely shocking to see that surgeon abandon the operating room, move to Silicon Valley, and become a tech futurologist obsessed with simulation theory and predicting the end of the world through data points. It's a desperate search for a larger pattern. But let me ask you this. Did he view his pivot into astrology as abandoning science, or did he think he was moving up to an even higher form of science?
That is a crucial distinction to make. In the 16th century, astrology was not considered parlor magic or superstitious nonsense.
Like it is in the tabloids today.
Right. It was widely regarded as the absolute pinnacle of scientific and mathematical inquiry. The movements of the planets were seen as the literal gears of a divine clockwork that dictated everything from politics to human health.
So it was just advanced physics to them.
Exactly. So in Nostradamus' mind, he wasn't abandoning science at all. He was abandoning the flawed, muddy, manual science of the apothecary for the pure, perfect, predictable mechanics of the cosmos. He was seeking the ultimate pattern.
He does eventually pull himself out of his grief, though. He travels extensively through France and Italy, supposedly experiencing some form of spiritual awakening on the road. By 1547, he settles in Salon de Provence. He marries a wealthy widow named Anne Ponsard, and they go on to have 6 more children.
He really starts over completely.
He even flexes his entrepreneurial muscles. He buys a 1/13 share in a massive, ambitious canal project organized by Adam de Crepon to irrigate the dry, barren land around Salon de Provence. He becomes a pillar of the community again.
But his professional focus has permanently shifted.
Right. In 1550, he starts publishing astrological almanacs, and this is the moment he Latinizes his name from Michel de Nostredame to the grander, more authoritative Nostradamus.
And those almanacs were essentially the farmer's almanacs of the Renaissance. They contain weather predictions, farming advice, and thousands of minor prophecies for the coming year.
And they were huge, right?
Wildly successful. They sold in massive numbers. And because of this newfound fame, European nobility began writing to him. begging for personal horoscopes and psychic advice. But what's fascinating from a historical perspective is that Nostradamus was actually a surprisingly sloppy astrologer.
Right. I was reading about this. Professional astrologers of the era would meticulously calculate a client's birth chart based on their exact time and place of birth. But Nostradamus frequently expected his wealthy clients to just supply their own charts for him to interpret.
He outsourced the hard math.
Yeah. And when he did try to calculate the planetary positions himself using the published ephemerides, the planetary tables of the day, he regularly failed to adjust the math for the specific latitude and longitude of his clients. His astronomical math was full of basic errors.
He was heavily criticized by professional astrologers of his time for it. Guys like Lawrence Vidal actually published entire pamphlets exposing Nostradamus's mathematical incompetence.
Like 16th century diss tracks.
Basically, Vidal pointed out that Nostradamus fundamentally misunderstood basic astronomical geometry. But the secret to Nostradamus's success was that his clients didn't actually care about the math.
They weren't checking his work.
Exactly. They weren't paying for astronomical precision. They were paying for the visions. They were paying for the aura of the mystic. And how he induced those visions brings us to the core mechanics of his practice. Because he didn't just look up at the stars and write down what he saw. He engineered a highly specific, intense sensory ritual.
Okay, let's unpack this part. The water scrying. We have breakdown analyses of his methods from modern esoteric practitioners and researchers analyzing the exact instructions Nostradamus left behind, because he actually documented his physical setup in the first 2 quatrains of his very first century.
He laid it all out.
I want to read the first one because it sets the scene perfectly. He writes, "Gathered at night in study deep I sat, alone upon the tripod stool of brass, exiguous flame came out of solitude, promise of magic that may be believed."
And the second quatrain continues the technical description. The rod in hand, set in the midst of the branches, he moistens with water both the fringe and foot. Fear and a voice make me quake in my sleeves. Splendor divine, the god is seated near.
It sounds so poetic.
It does, but when you strip away the poetry and look at the physical mechanics he's describing, it's an absolute masterclass in sensory manipulation and self-hypnosis.
Let's break down that physical setup. First, he mentions sitting on a brass tripod stool. In front of him is a large, deep bowl with a perfectly smooth rim made of glass, silver, or brass. This bowl isn't just resting on a table. It is elevated on a short brass pedestal or a cushion of fresh laurel boughs.
And that cushion is important to allow the metal or glass to vibrate freely.
Right. And the water inside the bowl is crucial. The instructions state it must never be stagnant. It had to be gathered from a moving, living, freshwater spring or river, ideally under the specific gravitational pull of a full moon.
Then there's the environment itself. He is working deep in the night. The room is completely dark except for what he calls the exiguous flame, which is a single small candle placed strategically where it provides faint illumination but won't catch his direct gaze.
So no harsh lighting.
Right. And complete silence. No music, no background noise. Then he takes a wand, traditionally cut from a fresh branch of laurel, hazel, or willow, and the branch must be fresh because it needs to retain the sticky, dried sap or resin on the bark.
The resin is the key to the whole operation, because he doesn't just stare at the water. He dips the wand, moistens it, and then drags the resin-coated wood clockwise around the smooth metal rim of the bowl. The friction of the sap against the brass creates a continuous humming resonance.
He turns the bowl into a massive singing bowl.
Exactly. The water inside begins to vibrate, form these complex geometric ripple patterns, and trickle off the wand.
Now consider what is happening to his neurobiology in that exact moment. You have extreme sensory deprivation from the dark, silent room. The only visual stimulus is the faint, flickering reflection of a single candle on the vibrating, chaotic surface of the water.
Which is mesmerizing on its own.
And the only auditory stimulus is the continuous, hypnotic, oscillating frequency of the singing bowl.
He's basically biohacking his own brain. We see people doing this today with ASMR videos or using binaural beats to induce deep, meditative states. The resonant frequency of the bowl, combined with staring into a chaotic visual field, forcibly shuts down the analytical, rational part of the brain.
The part that worries about math.
Exactly. The part of his brain that failed to save his family, the part that fumbled the complex astrological math. He suppresses all of that to open the floodgates of the subconscious.
In psychological terms, he is intentionally inducing a hypnagogic state, that threshold consciousness right between wakefulness and sleep. In this trance state, the brain becomes hyper-associative. It desperately searches for patterns in the visual noise of the rippling water and the auditory hum of the bowl.
Trying to make sense of the chaos.
Psychologists call this the incubation of visions. Nostradamus' mind was already heavily saturated with years of reading classical history, theology, and of course, traumatic memories of the plague. In this trance, those memories and texts blend together into intense, multisensory hallucinations.
He claimed he could actually smell the visions, right?
Yes, he claims to have seen cities burning, heard the clash of swords, and even smelled the smoke of future battles.
It is a brilliant, highly effective way to bypass your own conscious filter. But having an intense, terrifying vision of the future is only half the battle. The other, much more dangerous half is figuring out how to write it down and publish it without being executed.
The execution part was a very real threat.
Oh, definitely. Because predicting the death of kings and the collapse of the church in 16th century Europe wasn't just frowned upon, it was wildly illegal, and the penalty was an agonizing death.
This is where we must look at the immense pressure of the era. In 1555, Nostradamus publishes the first installment of his magnum opus, Les Prophéties, through the publisher Mosè Bonhomme in Lyon.
And it sells out instantly, right?
First edition sold out in a single day. It is structured into what he calls centuries, books, containing exactly 100 four-line poems, or quatrains, although mysteriously, Century II only contains 42 surviving quatrains.
Which is still a mystery.
It is, but the defining characteristic of these 942 surviving poems is that they're almost completely incomprehensible on a first read. They are a chaotic, dense puzzle box.
They are an absolute linguistic nightmare, and we know for a fact he did this intentionally. He admits it. One of the most revealing documents in our source material is the preface to Les Prophéties, which is written as a letter to his infant son, Caesar, dated March 1st, 1555.
That letter is the key to understanding his methodology.
It really is. In it, Nostradamus basically pulls back the curtain. He tells Caesar, "The key to the hidden prediction which you will inherit will be locked inside my heart." He explicitly says that he intentionally obscured his writing using ambiguous and enigmatic comments about future causes.
And he justifies this obfuscation by pointing to what he calls the injustice of the age. He writes that he doesn't want to unduly scandalize delicate sensibilities.
Delicate sensibilities, meaning the guys with the torture racks.
Exactly. He knew that if the monarchs, the bishops, and the inquisitors could clearly understand that he was predicting their downfall, their assassinations, or the fracturing of the Catholic Church, he would be arrested immediately.
Let's unpack the injustice of the age for a second, because it's vital to understand just how justified his paranoia was. We looked into the legal structures of the Inquisition during this period, particularly the operations of the Holy Office and the Venetian Inquisition. This wasn't like a chaotic, pitchfork-wielding mob.
No, it was highly organized.
The Inquisition was a terrifyingly bureaucratic legal machine. They had massive manuals of Latin jurisprudence detailing exactly what constituted heresy, witchcraft, or unapproved theology. They had strict protocols for interrogation, torture, and asset forfeiture.
It was an institutionalized terror system. And Nostradamus actually ran afoul of it.
He did.
Yes. In late 1561, he was arrested and briefly imprisoned at Marigny. And his crime wasn't casting spells or summoning demons. His crime was simply that he published his 1562 almanac without obtaining the prior written permission of a local bishop.
Wow. Just a licensing violation?
A simple publishing and licensing violation was enough to land the famous wealthy man in a dungeon. So when he talks about hiding his meaning, he is talking about basic primal survival. In the letter to Caesar, he even includes a highly theatrical story about taking his ancient forbidden occult books and throwing them into the fireplace.
I love this story.
He describes the fire burning with an unnatural flashing light, clearer than a normal flame.
Which is such a performance. He is putting on a show for the authorities. He is creating a public record that basically says, look, inquisitors, I burned the bad magic books. Everything I write now is purely based on mathematics, astronomy, and God's divine will.
He specifically distances himself from execrable magic.
He is walking a razor-thin tightrope. And to walk that tightrope, he invents a totally new way of writing. He uses what's called Virgilianized syntax. For those unfamiliar, he was taking French words but arranging them using the grammatical rules of classical Latin, like the poet Virgil.
Yes, which fundamentally breaks the meaning of the sentence for a casual reader. Latin uses word endings to determine if a noun is the subject or the object, meaning you can put the words in almost any order and still understand who's doing what.
But French doesn't work like that.
Not at all. French and English rely entirely on word order. So when Nostradamus takes a French sentence and scrambles the word order to mimic Latin, drops the prepositions and removes the articles, it becomes completely ambiguous who is doing what to whom.
It's just a word soup.
It is. He also throws in anagrams, word games, and mashes together vocabulary from Old French, Italian, Greek, Latin, and his local Provençal dialect.
It's brilliant cryptography. But here's where I have to push back on the whole endeavor. If you engineer a prophecy to be so vague, so densely packed with multilingual anagrams and scrambled syntax that literally no one on Earth can decode it until after the historical event has already occurred, what is the functional point of the prophecy?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. It's completely useless as a warning. It's like a meteorologist going on television and saying, at some indeterminate point in the future, moisture will violently descend from the heavens. And then 5 years later, when a Category 5 hurricane destroys Miami, the meteorologist says, see, I predicted Hurricane Miami perfectly.
That is the ultimate skeptical critique of Nostradamus, and it is entirely valid. But from his perspective in 1555, the point wasn't to give actionable warnings. The point was to secure his legacy and keep his life.
Fair point.
And paradoxically, that deliberate ambiguity is exactly what saved him and elevated him to the highest courts of Europe. If he had been specific, he would have been burned. Because he was vague, he became a source of intense fascination.
Right. Queen Catherine de' Medici, the wife of King Henry II of France, reads his 1555 almanac. It contains vague hints about threats to the royal family. Instead of sending the Inquisition to arrest him, she is intrigued.
She wanted answers.
She summons him to Paris. We know Nostradamus was utterly terrified on the journey, convinced he was riding to his execution, but she just wants him to draw up horoscopes for her children and explain the riddles. She becomes his greatest patron.
By the time he dies, she has appointed him counselor and physician in ordinary to her son, the new King Charles IX. Ambiguity made him a celebrity.
And that exact same ambiguity is what allows modern readers to keep him relevant today. Because the text is a linguistic Rorschach test, you can project almost any major historical trauma onto his four-line poems if you squint hard enough. Which brings us to the most fiercely debated aspect of his legacy, the greatest hits.
The big ones.
The specific quatrains that believers claim prove his undeniable psychic ability, and the ones skeptics use to completely dismantle him.
Before we dive into these specific historical interpretations, we need to lay down a strict ground rule for this analysis.
Yes, absolutely.
When we discuss Nostradamus' supposed predictions regarding politically charged historical events, like the rise of Adolf Hitler, the tragedies of World War II, or the French Revolution, we are strictly and impartially reporting on the translations and the popular claims surrounding the text.
Just laying out what's in the sources.
We're examining how his ambiguous poetry has been weaponized and interpreted over the centuries. We are absolutely not taking sides, nor are we endorsing the prophetic validity of these specific interpretations.
Agreed. We are analyzing the mechanics of retroactive belief. And the perfect place to start is the most famous prediction of his own era, the death of King Henry II.
A classic.
The quatrain in question, Century 1, quatrain 35, reads, "The young lion will overcome the older one on the field of combat in a single battle. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage. 2 wounds made 1, then he dies a cruel death."
The believer's interpretation of this is genuinely startling when you hear it for the first time. In 1559, 4 years after the book was published, King Henry II participated in a celebratory jousting tournament. He went up against a younger opponent, the Count of Montgomery.
The young lion and the older one.
Right. During a pass, Montgomery's lance shattered. The splintered wood drove through the king's golden gilded visor, the golden cage, and pierced his eye and temple.
2 wounds made 1.
Exactly. The king suffered in agonizing pain for over a week before dying of sepsis. You look at the text. Young lion overcomes older one. Single battle. Piercing eyes through a golden cage. Cruel death. It seems like an absolute slam dunk.
It is the cornerstone of the Nostradamus mythos. But when historians dig into the contemporary records, the illusion begins to crack. Modern scholarship points out that during the king's tragic death and in the immediate chaotic aftermath, absolutely no one in the French court was pointing to Nostradamus' book.
Not a single mention.
The prophecy wasn't connected in print to the death of King Henry II until 1614, that is, 55 years after the event happened. It was entirely a retrospective application by later commentators looking for a match.
That retroactive matching, or post-diction, is the engine that drives his enduring fame. Let's look at another classic, The Great Fire of London. Nostradamus writes, "The blood of the just will commit a fault at London, burn through lightning of 23 is the sixth. The ancient lady will fall from her high place, several of the same sect will be killed."
Okay, so how do believers interpret that?
Well, believers do the math. 23 is 60, plus 6 is 66. 1666 is the exact year of the Great Fire of London.
Wow, okay. The numerical coincidence of 23 is the 6 is what anchors this interpretation. But skeptics analyze the rest of the text and find it completely incongruous with historical reality.
Very incongruous.
Nostradamus specifically says the fire is caused by lightning. But the Great Fire of London famously started in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane due to a poorly extinguished oven, not lightning.
Just a baking accident.
Furthermore, references to the blood of the just committing a fault and an ancient lady falling from a high place require massive leaps of associative logic to connect to a bakery fire that mostly destroyed empty wooden buildings and displaced citizens.
The Rorschach test strikes again, and he uses very specific repeating archetypes that commentators just love to play with. During the French Revolution, believers pointed to his quatrains, talking about an enslaved populace, singing songs and demanding rights while princes and lords are held captive in prisons.
Which definitely sounds like the revolution.
He even uses the phrase, "headless idiots," which perfectly evokes the image of the guillotine. He also populates his poems with cryptic names. He repeatedly mentions a great leader named the Chiron.
Chiron is a perfect example of his anagrammatic games, right? It is almost certainly a simple anagram for Henriabach, referencing King Henry II.
Most likely.
Yeah.
He also references a triumvirate that will hold power for 7 years, and a religious figure who rises from nothing to absorb power like a sponge. These are archetypes of power dynamics that repeat throughout human history.
Because if you write about a corrupt leader falling from power, or a peasant uprising, eventually history will provide you with a matching scenario.
Exactly. But the most fiercely debated, and frankly the most unsettling interpretations revolve around the 20th century. Specifically, the quatrain that many claim predicted the rise of Adolf Hitler.
This is a huge one.
The text reads, "Beasts ferocious with hunger will cross the rivers. The greater part of the battlefield will be against Hister. Into a cage of iron will the great one be drawn, when the child of Germany observes nothing."
This specific quatrain represents the ultimate battleground between prophetic believers and linguistic skeptics. In the 20th century, popular translators like Erica Cheatham looked at this verse and made a massive assumptive leap.
A huge leap.
She argued that Hister is simply a slight misspelling or an intentional anagrammatic obscuration of the name Hitler. Proceeding from that assumption, the entire poem is translated through the lens of Nazi Germany and the Second World War.
But then you have skeptical investigators like James Randi, who look at the exact same text and dismantle it using historical geography and Latin grammar.
Randi is relentless.
He is. Randi points out that Nostradamus didn't misspell a 20th century dictator's name. Hister, or Ister, is simply the classical Latin name for the lower geographical region of the Danube River.
Oh.
Nostradamus used classical geography constantly in his writing. So Randi translates the line literally without the prophetic bias. Most of the army will be against the lower Danube.
Wow, so suddenly the eerie, impossible prediction of a modern dictator just vanishes, and what's left is a highly generic description of a military campaign near a famous European river.
This perfectly demonstrates the phenomenon of retroactive clairvoyance. We start with a known, traumatic historical event. We sift through thousands of vague, multilingual verses until we find a word that sounds vaguely similar, like Hister.
We discard the geographical context, mold the translation to fit our modern understanding, and then marvel at the prediction.
Exactly. And what is truly fascinating about this malleability is that it isn't just an innocent psychological trick played by modern readers. During times of crisis, this ambiguity can be actively weaponized.
You're talking about the propaganda wars of World War II. This is one of the most incredible subplots of the entire Nostradamus story. During the war, the text of Nostradamus literally became a battlefield of psychological warfare.
It really did.
Joseph Goebbels, the Reichsminister of Propaganda in Nazi Germany, was introduced to the Prophecies by his wife. Goebbels, being a master of mass psychology, realized that during times of catastrophic chaos, people naturally search for order, destiny, and the assurance that someone is in control of the narrative.
So Goebbels hired a Swiss astrologer named Karl Ernst Kraft. Their mission was to intentionally mistranslate and forge Nostradamus pamphlets.
They just made them up.
They created booklets filled with quatrains explicitly predicting that the Nazi war machine was invincible and that their victory had been ordained by the stars centuries ago.
And they didn't just hand these out in Berlin. They loaded these fake Nostradamus pamphlets into Luftwaffe bombers and dropped them out of airplanes over occupied European territories.
Airdropping fake prophecies.
They were using a 16th century mystic to wage psychological warfare, trying to convince the conquered populations that resisting the Nazis was pointless because the outcome was already written in the heavens.
And the strategy was so psychologically effective that the Allies realized they had to retaliate in kind. The British intelligence services, and later the Americans, began producing and airdropping their own fake Nostradamus pamphlets.
Fighting fire with fire.
Their versions, of course, predicted the imminent collapse of the German Empire and the triumph of the Allies. In the United States, MGM Studios even produced a series of short films based on Nostradamus prophecies, specifically designed to boost American morale and suggest that the Axis powers were destined to fail.
It perfectly encapsulates the fundamental nature of the prophecies. The text is so incredibly vague, so devoid of fixed meaning, that it can be actively utilized to support two diametrically opposed armies in a global war simultaneously.
It's the ultimate blank check.
And that weaponization of the text brings us directly back to where we started this deep dive. The modern internet, the Neil Marshall 9/11 hoax, and the quest to find out where Nostradamus actually got his material. Because over the last few decades, modern academic researchers have finally started to crack the code. They've found his cheat sheet.
Yes, they have. For centuries, the debate was binary. Either he was a psychic, tapping into the divine, or he was a fraud, making up random gibberish. But researchers like Jacques Halbron and scholars working in the archives of Lyon like Michel Comerat began doing intense comparative literature study.
Real detective work.
They started comparing the phrasing in a prophecy to the books that were physically available in 16th century France. And the results were revolutionary.
He wasn't staring into the future, he was looking backward. He leaned heavily, sometimes paraphrasing almost word for word, on older historical and astrological texts. One of the massive sources they identified is the Mirabilis Liber, published in 1522.
A very popular book at the time.
It was a popular compilation of ancient apocalyptic prophecies from figures like Girolamo Savonarola and the Tiburtine Sibyl. Nostradamus essentially took these older Latin prophecies, translated them into his chopped-up French syntax, and republished them.
He also relied heavily on a 1549 astrological treatise by Richard Rousseau titled Livre de l'État et Mutation des Temps. But perhaps most importantly, he pulled extensively from classical Roman and Greek historians, particularly Livy and Plutarch.
This is the real aha moment of his methodology. When you read a quatrain where he is vividly describing battles in the clouds, or the assassination of a senator, or a specific military flank maneuver near a river, he isn't having a psychic vision of a future war.
No, he's reading.
He is literally reading an account of an ancient Roman battle written by Plutarch 1,000 years earlier, and he is rewriting it in poetic form. But why? If he is just copying ancient history, why does he claim it's prophecy?
Because of a foundational astrological concept of the era known as comparative horoscopy. In the Renaissance, many believed that time was strictly cyclical, driven by the mechanical rotation of the heavens.
Time is a flat circle.
Exactly. The underlying mathematical theory was this. If the planets, say, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn align in a very specific configuration in the constellation of Aries, and during that exact alignment, the Roman Empire suffered a massive peasant revolt.
Yeah.
Then the next time that exact planetary alignment occurs, a similar revolt must happen again. History echoes based on celestial math.
So he was basically running a 16th century algorithm. It's incredible. He takes a massive data set of historical events, plagues, assassinations, battles from Livy and Plutarch. He maps that historical data onto the cyclical astrological tables, and he outputs a predictive model.
Yes.
If the planets align this way during the fall of Rome in the past, and my planetary tables say they will align that way again in the year 1590, then a great empire will fall in 1590. It's an algorithm. He is taking past data, feeding it through a mathematical model, and generating a future probability.
That is exactly what he was doing. And it is vital to note that in the 16th century, this wasn't considered plagiarism in the shameful modern sense. Compiling and synthesizing classical knowledge was the hallmark of Renaissance scholarship.
It was expected of a scholar.
And interestingly, Nostradamus himself seemed to know exactly what he was doing, which is why he frequently rejected the title of prophet. In a famous dedicatory letter to King Henry II in 1558, he explicitly states, "Some of the prophets predicted great and marvelous things to come, though for me, I in no way attribute to myself such a title here."
He tells the king, "I am just a mortal man whose perception is no further from heaven than the feet are from the earth." He knows he isn't speaking to God. He knows he is compiling cyclical data, and this algorithm explains the most famous, seemingly impossible detail of his entire body of work: the end date.
The famous 3797 date.
Right. Nostradamus famously claimed his prophecies extended precisely to the year 3797. It sounds so incredibly specific, like a date handed down from a burning bush. But it's just math, right?
It is entirely mathematical. It is a direct deduction based on the astrological calculations of his primary source, Richard Roussat. Roussat had recently published a timeline suggesting the year 2242 as the pivotal epoch, a possible date for the end of the world based on planetary cycles.
Okay, so where does the 3797 come in?
Nostradamus simply took Roussat's end date, did the math bridging the gap from his own current writing period, and arrived at the year 3797 as the culmination of the cycle. It wasn't a vision, it was arithmetic.
It is stunning how the modern spooky mythology has completely swallowed the deeply fascinating historical reality of the man. The mythology is so pervasive, people claim he was buried standing up so that no one could step on his grave.
Right, I've heard that one.
They claim that when his tomb was broken into during the French Revolution, the soldiers found him wearing a medallion with the exact date of his exhumation carved into it.
Which is, again, entirely apocryphal. We can trace the origins of that specific grave-robbing myth back to the diary of the English writer Samuel Pepys in 1667, more than a full century before the French Revolution even occurred.
People just love a good ghost story.
The myths began spinning out of control almost the moment he died in July 1566. Even the story that he perfectly predicted the exact night of his own death to his secretary, Jean de Chavigny, was likely a dramatic embellishment added by Chavigny himself to sell more books posthumously.
So we have dismantled the mythology. We have stripped away the magic. We have examined the immense, heartbreaking tragedy of the plague that drove him to seek answers in the stars. We've looked at the intense neurobiology of his vibrating brass scrying bowl, the political terror of the Inquisition that forced him to write in impenetrable riddles, and the classical history textbooks he quietly recycled into future predictions.
He's quite a legacy.
When you look at all of that, what is he? Is he a visionary? A desperate charlatan taking advantage of anxious French nobility, or just a brilliant Renaissance compiler of historical cycles?
I think he is all of those things, but most importantly, his work is a mirror. It perfectly captures something deeply permanently human. It captures our absolute desperate need to find order in chaos. When the world is terrifying, when an invisible plague wipes out your entire family, when the Inquisition can burn you at the stake for a missing signature, when wars ravage the continent, the idea that history is just random, meaningless violence is unbearable.
You want to believe there's a plan.
Exactly. The idea that history has a script, even if it is a terrifying apocalyptic script, is oddly comforting. It means someone somewhere is in control. It means the suffering has a pattern.
And that right there is exactly why you, the listener, and all of us still know his name today. Because we live in a world full of unpredictable global pandemics, sudden economic collapses, and chaotic wars. A world that honestly feels very much like the violent, unpredictable 1500s sometimes.
We really haven't changed that much.
We desperately want to believe that someone has the script. We want the X-ray of the future. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on that idea of the 16th century algorithm.
Okay, let's hear it.
Right now, in our modern era, massive tech companies are building incredibly powerful AI predictive models. They are training these digital models on the absolute entirety of human history. Every book, every economic crash, every article, every piece of data they can scrape. And they are using that past data to try and predict future market trends, human behavior, and global events.
Right.
When you think about it, aren't we just building a digital Nostradamus? We are feeding past historical data into a massive, incomprehensible black box, hoping the algorithm will tell us what happens tomorrow. And centuries from now, will future generations look back at our obsession with AI predictive algorithms with the exact same mix of awe, confusion, and deep skepticism that we aim at a 16th century apothecary gazing into a vibrating brass bowl of water.
It forces us to ask if our fundamental human nature, our terror of the unknown, ever truly changes at all.
The tools get more sophisticated, but the desperate desire to know what happens tomorrow remains exactly the same. That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for exploring the depths with us.